Hi, my name is Amar, and welcome back to Conversations with Jennifer. Jennifer's an estate planning attorney, and last time we started our conversations around blended families. This is part two, so if you haven't seen the first part, please go ahead and watch it. And so this time we're talking about trusts, right? Specifically with blended families. There's a couple of things that we want to make sure that we check off the boxes. Where do we start, Jennifer?
Great. So, as we discussed in the prior session, blended families are particularly unique and complicated planning situations. And so you have to pay particular attention or think about certain things in a different manner than just with a regular, husband and wife or spouses with kids of their marriage. And so today, I thought we could talk about certain topics or issues to think about when putting a trust together. And in the prior one, we talked about retirement planning and insurance policies that all go based on a beneficiary designation. With trust, you have a lot more flexibility and breadth of different provisions to put in place from a planning perspective in dealing with a blended family. You can think about, do we want a joint trust? Do we want two separate trusts and then a community property or a joint trust? So a 3-trust plan. With both of those different scenarios, you want to think about what happens when the first spouse dies and how the surviving spouse is going to receive those assets. Is it going to be an outright distribution, which is really unusual for blended families? I will come across it here and there, but for the most part with blended families, I typically see the assets held in trust for the surviving spouse. And then it's really important to walk through the different distribution provisions or access to those trust assets for that surviving spouse. You can see an abundance of different options. Income only to surviving spouse, and then surviving spouse really needs to use all of his or her own assets otherwise. You can see distributions for more catastrophic or emergency sort of situations. You can see distributions, all income to surviving spouse, and then principal for standard things like health, maintenance, and support. Obviously, how you define access to principal or distributions of principal is really important, depending on who the beneficiary is, so surviving spouse, and also depending on who the trustee is. So that's also a really critical part of the drafting or consideration process, is who's going to be managing this trust for this surviving spouse, because that trustee potentially has a lot of power and a lot of discretion and flexibility as far as when distributions of income or principal can be made for surviving spouse. We sometimes see surviving spouse as the trustee, and then surviving spouse really doesn't have anyone watching over him or her, as far as distributions. I've seen co-trusteeship situations where you have another person involved. Anytime, Amara, as you can probably guess, anytime you have more than one person acting as a trustee, that can get complicated. That can slow the process. You want to make sure it's a really good relationship. I just met with a blended couple, blended family just last week. And there's a marital trust or a trust for surviving spouse, and it's separate third-party 3 trustees who are going to be trustees of that trust. And my first question to her, surviving or spouse, was, do you get along well with trustees? Because you want it to be a good, working, positive relationship, so that they work well together, because there's nothing worse than having a trust administration where the trustee does not get along well with the beneficiaries. So you really want to think really long and hard about who that trustee is going to be.
Yeah.
Also, what powers you want to give surviving spouse under that trust. Sometimes you can give surviving spouse the power to withdraw a certain amount. So we sometimes see that as the 5 and 5 power. You can withdraw 5% of the assets over time, Do you want to give surviving spouse that power, or do you not? Also, the power to change the distribution provisions. That is a really rare provision I see with blended families, because you really want to ensure the assets are going where deceased spouse wanted them to go, the intended beneficiaries. But what additional powers do you want to give surviving spouse? And then finally, who's going to get these assets when surviving spouse passes away? It's typically, your child or children from a prior marriage, or maybe other family members who are going to receive that. I note that because it's really important, because under California Probate Code, residual or remainder beneficiaries, even though they're not vested, have the power to get information about a trust before it becomes vested. So who that residual beneficiary is, whether it's charity, children from a prior marriage, another family member, another individual, they can gain access and request information from the trustee before surviving spouse has even passed away, to know what are the assets in that trust, what are the distributions, what's the income, what are the expenses associated with it. So who that residual beneficiary is important to consider as well, because they do have some power to gain access, but also make the administration a bit more difficult or complicated, during the surviving spouse's lifetime.
And I bet these conversations are hard to have, because, you're in this blended family, you trust your new spouse, and you don't want to say, hey, although I trust you, I don't want to, give you all the marbles to kind of do what you want with. And I want to ensure that my children or these charities or whatever do get access to funds when you do pass, right?
Yeah.
So how do you navigate that conversation?
I was going to say, it can be a very awkward conversation. It's such an important conversation to have, though, especially when both parties are alive. And I oftentimes will even talk to, so the parents of that blended family, talk to them about talking to the children now while they're both alive about what the trust provisions are, so that no one can say, well, I didn't know dad wanted that, or I didn't know mom wanted that. We didn't have a conversation about it. Obviously, some people feel differently about that and really want to keep the provisions close to their vest and don't want to present this to the family. But really walking through it, and I always find it's really important to say, to explain, not only is it important for me to make sure I've captured your estate planning wishes, but it's also important that we have clear and clean documents to protect that surviving spouse, maybe, or to protect the residual beneficiaries, or to protect them both. And so putting provisions in place and walking through, Amar, I'm the devil's advocate most of the time when we have these conversations. And I always say, I'm sure it's never going to happen, but what if? And walking through that. And then the best case scenario is none of this happens and everyone gets along really well. And the trust is well drafted, covering all the different parameters and provisions. Or alternatively, if there are any questions down the road, I can say, no, I talked to your dad about this or your mom about this multiple times. We walked through all these options and this is what they wanted. So it's difficult, but it's a really important part of the estate planning process and making sure we have the right plan in place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is good. When we're dealing with blended families, I think the number one thing you can take away from this conversation is to make sure that you have open communication and that you're describing your wants and your wishes while both of you are alive, while your children are alive, and you can have that type of family type conversation. If you're looking to navigate that type of conversation, please reach out to Jennifer or myself, and we'll be happy to kind of walk you through the process of having that dialogue, as well as reviewing your documents to make sure they are what you want them to be, right? So please hit the like button. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, comment, all the good stuff for YouTube. And thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Yep.